is for the next session. There was a mistake. He's not joining us tonight. He's joining us for spring session number 5, which will be next week.
Okay. So I was waiting to be introduced to Bradley.
Yes.
Jacob, and so far the 3 of us.
Okay. So I think let's start the session. And what we'll do is that I can see there's more people joining. And just for basically to welcome you all, the panelists and the audience, to this spring session about decolonizing fashion. I think it's an interesting subject that we're going to introduce tonight, and so sort of brainstorm ideas and everything around that. Okay, so just to note, if the audience wants to ask a question to any of the panelists, just do it in the chat box and then add the button, the add signal, and the name of the panelist, and we will answer it ASAP. Some of my colleagues will also assist in that. If there's any interesting questions coming up, we can actually do that. Also, let me just, for now, I just want to not share my screen anymore and have, just hold on for me quickly. That's not it. Sorry. Here we go. All right. Let's just put on another screen while we're waiting. Okay, we are there. All right. Okay, so for the audience for now, I just want to ask, maybe just to kick off this session, to maybe if you think about African fashion, I know we've got a lot of students in our audience. If you think about African fashion, can you maybe think of a word and disperse it in the chat, and maybe just your name and where you're joining us from, just that we can see for interest's sake. All right. Okay. So first of all, tonight I want to, or this afternoon, late afternoon, I want to welcome our panelists, and especially the owner of the session, Dr. Erica Schreef, and she holds a PhD in African Studies and is a fashion curator, academic, and co-founder of the African Fashion Research Institute. Her work engages with intersections of fashion, memory, sustainability, I'm a bit nervous, repair, education, and history. She has led the fashion department at the Zaismaka in Cape Town, published various articles, developed fashion curricula, and sits on the board of the research collective for colonializing fashion, the Council for International African Fashion Education, and the International Journal for Fashion Studies. So welcome, Erica. We are very excited to have you here tonight. I know you want to share something with us before you begin, but you've got the platform.
Thank you very much. Frankie, I'm delighted to be here this evening. We have with us a number of other guests, and I'm just wondering if you would like to just do a round of introductions while everybody's just coming through into the room.
I think that's a great idea. All right, so we are waiting for Kenneth Appiah, which will be joining us shortly. We've got Shana Gonzalez, which is currently working as a conscious marketing consultant using audience-relevant messaging, creative direction, and business relations to integrate fair trade practices and social equity into campaigns. Okay, so she's a woman of many talents, as you can see. She's also created content for various events and has written for various institutions. But more importantly, she talks and she writes about identity politics, gender, race, spirituality, decoloniality, fashion, and working in business. Okay. Then we've got Jacob, our born New Yorker, and which has published various articles on fashion. He's an educator, an artist, and co-founder and designer of the gender-neutral clothing line All We Remember, which is quite fabulous. If you all can if you don't know that, please go and look up. He's also an instructor in the English Creative Writing and Fashion Studies departments at Columbia College Chicago, which is a small, or it's a private college specializing in arts and media. Okay. Then we've got a fellow graduate from Stadio, previous known as LASOF, and she's got a strong passion for trend forecasting and research and the deeper meanings around language of clothing. She's currently busy, I hope I've got this right, with her master's degree that investigates the psychologies, histories, and disruptions of African fashion, and how African creatives can materialize these new ideals in modernity. So I welcome you all, and I'm looking forward to that. And maybe, Erica, if I can set the scene and maybe just explain a bit around the topic that we are going to discuss, or do you want to set the scene, Salang?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Frankie. I was hoping that Kenneth would have a chance to join us, and I think he has joined us, but it might be difficult without your camera on, Kenneth, if you're in the room. Hi, Kenneth.
Hi, guys. Great to be a part of it.
Great. So,
sorry to butt in. Can I introduce Kenneth?
Please
do. He's here. All right. He's a researcher, an author, design practitioner, and fashion business consultant, and he's got with a strong focus on luxury apparel in that sector, and he works around that. He does research, and he's published various articles in journals, and he's a regular speaker at conferences. So at present, Kenneth is collaborating with Macmillan on marketing and emerging economies. So welcome, Kenneth. We're very glad that you're here to join us tonight, and we look forward to your valuable input.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you, Kenneth. Kenneth, I'm just checking how your connection is, and if you're good with your camera for your presentation.
Yes, I'm okay.
Great. Okay.
Yeah,
so we didn't.
Strong.
Great. Thank you. We didn't really kind of discuss around how we would host this conversation and in what kind of interdisciplinary dialogue we're really trying to engage. I think the important thing that we're trying to address is bringing these two concepts together, because I think fashion as a concept and as a set of ideological associations that come with it, together with the notion of decoloniality, and to try and bring decoloniality into dialogue with fashion. And I think that would really be the important, coming together of the panel that we have today. So I know that Frankie, you wanted to share one or two images. I'm happy to lead with a brief introduction if you'd like, or if you want to start with the images. I know you said you wanted to start with them.
Yes, let's start with them, and then we will. I will. Okay, let me just get that. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. I just want to start. So I think decolonization is quite a can of worms, and and it's quite a contentious issue. So it's our discussion tonight is going to be around the cultural richness of African textiles, and we're going to focus on the educational factor around that. So there's certain problem areas still within the educational sector that we can discuss, like like African print and the sweatshirt sort of textiles being imported by China into South Africa, and the things around licenses not African owned, and what strategies are we doing and making, and where are the gaps into that. So there's a well-known South African photographer that investigates the archive and found very interesting images that spanned from around about 1890 to 1950. And his name is Santa Mafeking, and he developed this body of work that actually looked at how people saw themselves, African people saw themselves around this time. And he was saying that these, in his words, the images that urban Black working and middle-class families had commissioned, requested, and sanctioned, they have been left behind by dead relatives, meaning the photographs. So he found it in the archive all over the place, which is quite interesting. But what is more pertinent to us tonight is to the questions that he asked. He asked, who is gazing? Okay, who are these people? Also, do these images serve as testimony of mental colonization? Okay, so, and according to Alexandra Dodd, she spoke about these photographs, and she said that they reflected the sensibilities, aspirations, and self-image of a particular class of Black South Africans at a threshold of moment in history, which I quite found in where we are at the moment. There's been, if just to set the scene for the audience, is that colonialization, the colonial systems began to crumble between the 1940s and the 70s, when the empires, European empires, fell and people had more independence, and it started with primary resistant movements in East Africa, and for us, especially in Southern Africa, with the Ndebele Shona uprisings, and then also in Kenya. And the concept comes from the Latin American modernity and coloniality, and it really gained movement after the Cold War and the loss of appeal in the 20th century of Marxism. So there's a lot to get back to Alexandra Dodd and that threshold moment in history. There's various writers and critical thinkers that's been thinking and writing about decolonization. And Francis Fukuyama, for example, said he described it as the end of history and the last man. And then our big decolonial thinker, Frantz Fanon, wrote that decolonization never takes place unnoticed, for it influences individuals and modifies them fundamentally, which is very true. We also have a very famous critical theorist, Homi Bhabha, that spoke about exactly this, and he said, we must not merely change the narratives of our history, but transform our sense of what it means to live. And I think if we take it back to fashion, and I just want to share the next screen with you. This is a London-based photographer that really works around fashion and coloniality, and he I find these images quite amazing, in contrast then with the turn of the century, a very Victorian feel to how people, to identity and how people looked at themselves. Okay. So, Erica, what we are talking about is basically how do education, fashion raises questions around identity, culture, And how is this really relevant in a fashion educational space, for example?
Thank you, Frankie. If you'll just stop sharing.
I'll do that.
Thank you so much. You know, I think, Frankie, I think the questions that we're putting on the table here really deal with this intersection of identity and politics. And I think just in a whirlwind, you've tried to like throw a couple of names into the mix to try and sort of tease out possibilities of this dialogue. I think there's a real fear around this concept of decolonizing fashion, because it just feels so complicated to unravel the extent to which coloniality has made an imprint on the way in which fashion is seen, reproduced, and I'm aware of these kinds of binaries that just continue in fashion, tradition and modernity, gender binaries, the West and the non-West, all these binaries that have been locked into place, and there's a kind of comfort that comes with that, because that is the thing that is being presented and tested and tried. But that is the thing that is ruining the planet. And so it isn't a case of, well, should we or shouldn't we be thinking about decolonizing fashion? It is absolutely essential that we start to break away from these rigid binaries, from these rigid constructs of who owns fashion and who doesn't own fashion. So, you know, I think a really rich set of challenges that are confronting not just South African fashion education institutions, but I think are challenging global fashion education institutions, and all the related practices of fashion, being a designer, being in the media. How do museums present fashion? How do museums present fashion from the past? So I will, you know, I really want this to be quite an open kind of conversation, but I thought I could just start with, I'm just going to present here. I could just start with a short preview, just leading on from what you started with, Santam Mofokeng's work. And one of the artists that we have worked with quite extensively is in dialogue is Wanda Lefoto, and as one of the co-founders of the Sartists, this particular set of photographs that he took, and the tenor series was from about 2014, was very much an ode to the work of Santam Mofokeng. But what is more interesting is when we look at his latest collection, and we'll just see his Instagram, and you can see, you know, the references to the Black Photo album in his latest collection, and very clearly cites, you know, the relevance and the importance of the Black Photo album in contemporary work, in contemporary sort of kind of reclamation of that past and owning of that past, and not as a kind of disavowal of the past. So I thought a really rich place to start. So just very briefly, just to get us into thinking about decolonizing fashion studies. And so in 2019, the African Fashion Research Institute was co-founded by myself and Lesiba Mabitsela. And, you know, as Frankie, as you pointed out, I'm a curator, lecturer, and academic, and worked at Zayat Maka for a year in 2018. my work has really been really critically looking at not just what's happening in fashion, but also what's happening in museums, what's happening in fashion collections. I've been really involved in working with curricula, in terms of research, in terms of development, publishing, and really the work that it is to put African fashion into a global dialogue. So one of the ways in which, I mean, at the start of the session, you question, how do we put these two words together, Africa and fashion? And I'd say that, 10 years ago, if you said the word African fashion, generally a search for those two terms together would not come up with any contemporary or critical writing around African fashion. So these very important moments, so this particular exhibition, 21 years, was very much about making histories with South African Fashion Week, and that making histories was to insert into the public realm, into the public imagination, that a history of South African fashion is possible and it exists. So curatorially making a presence known, to insert a story. So exhibitions was the first thing that Lesiba and I worked on. Also at Zeitsmacher, Lesiba was involved in the exhibition called The Main Complaint, and this particular project called Re-Institute. And again, using fashion as a means to critique a particular coloniality that exists in institutions such as museums or banks or corporations, corporates, but even largely society as an institution, and the way in which the suit, in terms of the men's suit, reinscribes a particular colonial form of identity. And so this particular project deconstructed the suit and questioned other ways of being, other ways of embodying masculinity that wasn't defined specifically and only by the suit. So inserting critique into public spaces through fashion. The first project that we launched as AFRI, as the African Fashion Research Institute, and this is where a really important component of our work in decolonizing the narrative is the idea of making an exhibition. So this was the International Fashion Showcase. It was an exhibition that was held in London, and 3 African designers presented at this exhibition, and we felt compelled. It is absolutely essential that an audience in Africa, in South Africa, in Africa, can access the work of our own designers. So we returned the exhibition from London in the digital form. So Fashioning Brave New Worlds was the first virtual fashion exhibition on the continent, but we didn't just return the exhibition as a British exhibition. We inserted our own voice, and we inserted an African voice into the exhibition. So if you go to our website, which is AfriDigital, you will be able to access the exhibition, the virtual exhibition, and you'll be able to access these interviews that we had and hear the voices of designers. So as part of the Decolonial project, it is about allowing or surfacing voices from the continent that are saying and speaking a decolonial fashion narrative, and demonstrating this through this very particular virtual platform, digital platform that ensures access. Another project that continues this kind of digital access, but also digital affordances, is Lesiba's recent project in collaboration with the Institute for Creative Arts, and was called Cutting Room Project. And again, through the digital form, creating an alternate archive. So Santa Mofa King's photographs were, the Black Photo album was like an alternative archive, and we're surprised, we're surprised that this archive exists. We should not be surprised any longer. These are really, really powerful colonial tools that have been created to silence those other kinds of narratives. In the same way with the Cutting Room Project, this was about women seamstresses in Rex Trueform building whose voices, whose histories have been silenced, have been erased. They have been erased. And how do we surface in the now? How do we surface in the contemporary these dialogues? So another, using the digital as a site for these voices. The digital, in terms of fashion education, and in terms of, and I think Kenneth might speak to this as well, the digital in terms of being able to reach new audiences, being able to speak to colleagues across the continent and build up a Pan-African conversation, I think has also been an incredibly empowering process where fashion education has gone online. So this particular project or online course was developed by myself and Dr. Heaton Baggett, called African Fashion with a question mark in parentheses. So Siviwe might be able to talk to this project a little bit more, but we host an online 7-week course where we engage with participants. And I mean, we've had incredible sort of diverse participants in the classroom, in the session, in the course. So we've had like Valerie Steele, and we've had Daniela Gula, and we've had a PhD researcher from Hong Kong, somebody from New Zealand, and designer from Johannesburg, a photographer from Cape Town. So a wide range of participants, again, using the digital platform to disrupt the way in which these conversations are possible. Just to flag that next week there'll be a summit, fashion education summit, the Council for International African Fashion Education, and I think you mentioned that I'm on the board of this council. A really exciting, and the digital has literally collapsed these kinds of geographic distances and impossibilities. So the decolonial potential of these kinds of dialogues on the African continent around fashion education. So I think this might be a really interesting space to continue the dialogue. Just very quickly, just to say that part of AFRI as African Fashion Research Institute has really been about building community, building a community, supporting alternative voices. So we've got Siviwe, and Shana is also in there. So very exciting. But just, being able to build a community and share and showcase the kind of research and decolonial praxis. So in 2 years, we've really started trying to develop multiple outputs. And just lastly, just to say that, we wouldn't be doing this alone. I'm part of the Research Collective for Decoloniality and Fashion, part of the Council for International African Fashion Education. We did something with Centraal Museum in the Netherlands, with the University of Arts in London. So these kinds of conversations that are not singular. So part of the decolonial possibilities is to be able to create the strength of these dialogues to disrupt coloniality and to disrupt the erasure and disrupt the lack of access through building community. And so, the very big part of creating new archive is also about creating new futures. So I'm gonna end with that because I think there's still quite a bit of possibility for conversation to continue. And I'd love to hear more from the rest of the panel. Frankie, I think you're on mute.
I am. I'm not anymore. All right. So, but I'm really interested in you know, in the luxury sort of sector, and I'm talking to Kenneth. How do you, if Erica's talking about how to disrupt and how to create, which is quite interesting. How did that work in sort of your speciality and in your field, Kenneth?
Hi, everyone, and thanks again for having me. Thank you, Erica. That was a very wonderful introduction. Yes, so luxury presents quite peculiar, and if I should say, a much more profound area where decolonization is relevant. Similar to the narrative that attempts to exclude other geographies from the dialogue on global fashion, luxury remains one of the most important sites of contestation. I mean, it has always been between social classes and social and economic classes. And more recently, it has also become a site of contestation between the diverse metropoles on the adjacent sides of the globe, both the North and the South. So we've always had that deeply engraved perception or ideology that says that luxury is European, it's of European hegemony. Never have we ever, I mean, if a decade ago, it was unheard of to literally juxtapose fashion in Africa, then it would shock you to know that even as we speak now, it is still almost just as what you call it shocking to put together luxury in Africa. And all of this sits within the context of coloniality and the need literally for decolonization. We have always, when I struggle to pronounce the name, but so probably you might have to forgive me. When Koyano, the Koyano's colonial matrix of power describes these four interrelated domains, that's the control of economy, gender and sexuality, authority, and then subjectivity and knowledge. And where I'm most keen about is subjectivity and knowledge. Subjectivity and knowledge in the sense that you are able to accept this plurality of epistemology. I mean, like different or diverse kinds of knowledge or ways of knowing or ways of doing. And the question has always been, what is luxury? The definitions of luxury always revolves and evolves around the capitalist system that we have all come to know. It's capitalist, it's commercial, it has to be capitalist, it has to be commercial. And it almost always excludes what is happening in other parts of the world, including Africa. And that is where it gets interesting. In very recent time, we've seen quite a lot of I would say not a lot of, but it is actually warming up. Recently, there was a book by Mehita Ikani and from the other editor, but then basically on African luxury, and it's just amazing how it basically dissects the topic of luxury and the diverse ways that it sort of is manifested on the continent of Africa than the usual or than what we already know. And so one of the ways in which I see decolonization literally emerging in luxury is we're beginning to have more voices not only in academia. And when I talk about academia, I am myself making some significant effort in that regard. Until when I started researching luxury somewhere back in 2017, I started working. I briefly interned at Luminance. I'm sure you would be aware of Luminance in Hyde Park, and I kept asking myself the question. Luminance had a very interesting system, and Luminance had both local luxury brands and also international luxury brands. So you'd have your Givenchy's, you'd have your Chanel's sitting side by side with David Lally and Makossa and the likes. And the question that kept bothering me was, I could see that vast disparity in price points. So the question was, why exactly was it? I mean, the same pants suit that sold by Chanel could be 10 times the price of what Makossa could sell his. And that literally sparked my interest into exploring luxury in South Africa. And so far, I've been able to, my first research basically bordered around, I say, the supply side of things, where I sort of engaged the brands themselves, quite a number of brands, and I was interrogating the whole concept of value, in why local brands struggle to command the kind of value that international brands, and all of which also sits equally within this concept of coloniality. I mean, like, we have been subconsciously sort of primed to believe and appreciate that what is valuable is always what is imported, it's always what is Western, it's always that sort of imagery that says that what we have is of inferior quality. And all of these were avenues via which the colonial agencies were able to control how we think and how we basically appreciate what we have. And so that was basically what drew me into critical luxury studies. My MA, I also researched about, this time around, the consumer side of it, where I started asking about what consumers think about local South African brands. Maybe even the term local itself is also somewhat a binary. Luxury brands of South African origin. And I used the consumer-based brand equity from ACA to sort of explore the dynamics of how consumers interact and engage with luxury brands of South African origin. And this is what is happening. There is a growing what you call body of work and voices that are engaging on African luxury on the academic side, and then you also see also a very engaging what you call a discourse happening also in practice as well. We've seen today, was it today? Was it yesterday? Lucanio Ndingi won the Karl Lagerfeld award during the LVMH prize, which is just almost really incredible. I mean, like, especially for the fact that just in 2019, there was another prize that came to South Africa, that is Thebe Magugu. So you can really see that on the practice side of it, the brands themselves are also making major inroads. And I believe that as time goes on, as more voices on basically the diverse aspects or the diverse value chain of the creative industry, basically of luxury in Africa, continue to emerge, we actually will be doing. I mean, let's not forget about the whole the dynamics around the actual act of decolonizing. I mean, decolonial studies is one thing, and decolonization is another, which happens to be us owning the narrative and us propagating what we believe is a true luxury on the global space.
Thank you, Kenneth. That's very interesting. Shayna, I was wondering, You work a lot with identity politics in combination with fashion, and there's Kenneth was talking about the concept of value, which is extremely interesting. So how does that connect sort of in your field of work? Or how do you perceive what's happening around these concepts?
Thank you, Frankie. And I just want to take this opportunity to say hi to everybody and thank you all for joining us. Kenneth raised some incredibly powerful points, I must say, especially sort of highlighting the differences between decoloniality and decolonizing, which I would, if I may, before I answer your question, Frankie, just maybe not collapse those two, because yeah. So, and I mean, you kind of touched on it at first as well when you introduced your quotes by Homi Bhabha and Frantz Fanon, when you were sort of talking about the end of history and the end of a period, you know, so those ends of history and ends of a period that were from the 1950s to 1970s were the end of a kind of period of colonization. But when we're talking about decoloniality, the thing about decoloniality is it's more than marking a time frame, and it's more so about acknowledging an experience. And that's where it sort of evolved from post-coloniality and from an act of decolonizing. The very important thing about decoloniality as well is it is not claiming to decolonize anybody, which the verb of decolonizing has within it, because in doing that, we'd sort of be reiterating exactly what coloniality is and what coloniality is about. So decoloniality is about acknowledging the experience of coloniality and of colonialism, and finding those touch points in multiple ways. And so I'd like to actually come back to what to Santo Mafeking, the artist and photographer that you spoke about. Because something that I read about him after his death is a New York Times writer wrote about his work. I'm actually just going to find it so that I can quote it exactly. He said about his photos, it's not about what you see in these photos, it's about what you don't see but feel. And that reminded me of a conversation that I had, that, you know, with Erica, we had with the collective for decoloniality and fashion, of which we're both on the board. Walter Manolo is a key writer and thinker and teacher for what's called the Decolonial Summer School, and he's done a lot of writing on decoloniality as well. He's probably considered one of the fathers of decoloniality, because he's one of the few that are still alive, and he is kind of like a father because he's so old and wise. But he once said, you know, when thinking about decoloniality, it's not about, you must think about where you feel decoloniality, where you feel coloniality, and where you feel coloniality is where there is an opportunity for decoloniality. And so and that's also where we get the intersection of what both Erica and Kenneth have also touched on in terms of multiple narratives, which is a very key underpinning and key idea for decoloniality as well, is it's what's called pluriversality. So there is and this is also why I want to make a very clear distinction between the so-called decolonizing and decoloniality, because I think decolonizing would also again bring us back into a universal way of decolonizing. Whereas when you start to think about, when you start to I was going to say think about ways to feel, right? Whereas when we start to find feelings of coloniality and of colonialism, and locate those, it opens up an opportunity for pluriversal experiences of decoloniality, because each and every single person experiences decoloniality differently. And I think that's at least where my own work comes in with identity politics, and how and these different intersections between, again, as Erica brought up, the binaries of black and white, male and female, natural and synthetic, all of these different binaries, which don't really leave any room for pluriversality. It forces us to fit into one or fit into the other. Whereas my intersectional work deals with my own personal intersectionality of being at the same time many different things. And I think the problem with capitalism and with coloniality and with, or no, I'm not going to say capitalism, I'm going to say with modernity, and I'm not even going to go there, with modernity and coloniality as we've come to understand it, is that we have been forced into identifying into some or other of these binaries. And it's because these binaries make us more or less productive for the modern world that we're supposed to progress in. So it's either I am, there's an availability of black or white, whereas white was the better one and black was the worse one. There is an availability of man or woman, where man was the better one and woman was the worse one. There are all of these binaries that have within them hierarchies, and so we're constantly trying to live up to these expectations. But the second that we break away from those binaries and acknowledge our own personal experiences that don't fit into these identities and these binaries, it becomes more pluriversal. So what I'm trying to say is, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to sound esoteric at all, but what I'm trying to say is so for my own identity, I've been with the Research Collective for Decoloniality and Fashion since January, and January is when I started working for myself and started re-questioning my own identity and started realizing that the things that I find most valuable about myself have nothing to do with the ways that modernity has asked me to identify myself. Yes, being a woman is important for me insofar as I'm a feminist and a womanist, and an intersectional womanist at that, but it's more things like spiritual, it's more things like being vegan, it's more things like it's more things like I'm a truth seeker, it's I take care of myself, it's I'm an activist, I am a researcher. It's these other things are the things that are more important to me, these are the things that define not just what I do but my work and the value that I bring to my work. So when I work with a client, for instance, the first thing that I'm saying is I see the value in what you are doing for the world, and that is the value that I'm trying to communicate within the marketing strategy that I'm going to create for you. And that is, I think that is it. Basically, yeah. So I hope that I've made sense. But just in terms of the value that Kenneth was talking about, this just, again, it goes back to, yes, I completely agree with what he said about how, sorry, I'm just going to go back to it again because he said it so articulately, but it almost always excludes what is happening in Africa. And just the way that the diverse ways that luxury can be manifest in Africa. I did an interview. So Frankie, you were saying that, there's just so many things in my bio that I guess it becomes convoluted, and I agree with you. I'm still trying to figure that out myself. But I did an interview with a brand called Thesis Lifestyle, which is a South African brand. And what's incredibly crucial about Thesis Lifestyle is their narratives and their entire business strategy is drawn from township life in South Africa. Now, if we look at township life, and if you look at their creative direction and their marketing material and the events that they even coordinate their marketing strategies and brand around, it is about what is happening in township lifestyle. And that is incredibly important because, you know, as Kenneth said, luxury almost always excludes Africa. And to even think of, I thought it was quite funny that the book is called On African Luxury, because it kind of, luxury should be luxury. If we're opening up the term, there shouldn't be an African luxury. It should be luxury, and Africa can be considered as luxurious as well. And that, I think, is really crucial for what Thesis Lifestyle does. Their stores are in the township. You can only get hold of their clothes if you come to the township, and the other option is online, and they have sales throughout the country. But why they're really, really important for me is because they give us a touch point into a part of our history and a part of our people that has really, really been really neglected. And this is why it always goes back to identity for me, and it always goes back to identity politics for me. And that's why I always make note to mention the different, well, there's two things. It's one, acknowledging the forms of productive identities that have been outlined for us in modernity and coloniality, and the other ways that we need to try and identify ourselves. I heard a very important quote by someone I don't remember, but he was just saying that, you know, one of the most damaging aspects of, you know, segregated history is the expectations that have been put onto people. Of the example that he made specifically was of people of color, the expectations that Black men of color have. And this was during I was listening to this talk during the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, is there's an expectation of Black men of color to fail or do all of these different crimes. And the second that, you know, that sort of expectation is projected onto any of us, that's where the double consciousness comes in. If we think about people like, you know, Du Bois, who's spoken about double consciousness, when we have those sort of expectations projected onto our identities as people that have been subjugated and erased, we live with the one, the trauma, two, the pressure, three, the effort of having to constantly think about the ways that we're being perceived and the expectations that we have of ourselves, and trying to constantly outweigh those expectations rather than just finding the parts of our identity that actually matter to us and trying to serve the world from that point of view. I hope again that wasn't too esoteric and that it made sense. And yeah, that's where I'm hoping that's where we're able to take stand in what we find valuable and contribute that value to the industry, to the world, to education, to people. Thank you.
Thank you, Shana. Yeah, that's great. Jacob, I was wondering while we're talking about this, does anything resonate with you? How do you negotiate this with your All We Remember clothing line? But is there, you know, how do you have these same kind of frustrations? Can you maybe think of how it will sort of, but is there any similarities around these subjects that Shana was talking about?
Yeah, I think number one, Shana, you made so many incredible points and observations, and frankly introduced me to a number of ideas and words. I wasn't familiar with the term pluriversality, which is incredible. Something actually that made me think of in regards to All We Remember is the idea of localization. And I actually think that's an area where luxury could go, in the sense that luxury in Chicago, Illinois is, you know, not the same as luxury in Soweto. In my opinion, in terms of we you know, people live in different climates, different cultures. And something that I'm really fascinated by in terms of decoloniality is greater localization in the way that writers like Adrienne Marie Brown writes about, or Robin Wall Kimmerer, or Thomas Berry, who died a number of years ago but considered himself an ecologian. And the fact that we are sort of fragmented, and many of us, I don't want to say all of us, but many of us, especially those operating in capitalist white supremacist societies, are estranged from nature and estranged from our environments. So I think something that we're interested in doing with All We Remember is being more local. We're definitely imperfect at it, but I mean, we work with a local women-owned cut and sew manufacturing cooperative. We work with a local dyer who hand dyes all of our garments using botanical dyes. And we keep a lot of our work in-house. With that said, we do source some materials from elsewhere. Yeah, like some of our fabrics for our upcoming collection are, they're GOTS certified organic cotton, but they are sourced from a company based here, but that does production in Pakistan. And so I think for me, something that I'm really, again, interested in terms of some of the things that have been brought up already in terms of value, in terms of luxury, I think is having brands and people in general just be tied more to where they are. Having local mills, having local cut and sew factories, having local dyers. Also because if we are jumping to you know, decolonization versus decoloniality in the ways that Shana were defining them, I don't think that fashion can be decolonized, because I think that fashion is, it is defined by the new, right, and by what is trendy. And all of that falls within capitalism. It's defined by consumption. I think that clothing can be decolonized. Style can be decolonized. And so for me, as a brand, that's really challenging, because jumping back to what Kenneth said about value, those things I think even hold true for brands in the US. Like a garment we make might have way more put into it from a material, pattern making, design, dye, all of those different standpoints than something made by, you know, made by Prada, let's say. But Prada most likely is going to be able to sell a similar garment for 4 or 5 times the amount of money. And I think a lot of that has to do with, again, capitalism, white supremacy, the value that's put on European brands, but I think also it has to do with logomania, and even with like ideas related to like situationist theory and the spectacle, and the value that the fashion industry as a whole and many of us put on brand recognition and the ways in which we communicate value through clothing, and also often sometimes try to define the value of ourselves through the clothing that we wear. So someone wearing a piece from my brand is, or another local brand, wherever that brand is located in the world, is not going to have as much cachet, most likely, within the global economy as if they're wearing a designer, you know, a European designer luxury brand, because of this sort of like cultural psychic value that has been put on brands like that. I don't know if that makes sense, or hopefully that connects to the points that Shana and Kenneth have brought up so far.
Sipiwe, do you find that in your studies to bring it, to really bring it back to more education, how can we? What are the gaps? What kind of solutions, if you think about current education systems, any of your experiences that you can share with us?
Thank you so much, Frankie, for including me in this evening's dialogue. Good evening, everyone. So I just want to correct you a little bit. I'm not actually doing my master's as yet, but I'm working towards a program. I like your eagerness, though.
Just stop thinking, just do it.
So, I mean, I'm going to start with an example that's easy for me. And that would be basing it on my life. And that would be starting with the course that Erica and Heaton have developed. I think from an educational perspective, just stepping out of the usual setting of, what's the word I'm looking for? Themes and just the structuring of expectation from what the relationship between educator and student is, but also the relationship between institution and then its inhabitants. I think that definitely needs to be restructured. And when you look at courses like Heaton and Erica's course, where it is online, but not just online. It is a collective of different minds within the fashion industry, but also outside of the fashion industry. And then just us taking these different avenues of approaching what is decolonial fashion, or what is us attempting to decolonize our thinking around decolonial fashion. Those tend to just like shift a bit of the tectonic plates in the standard way of approaching education in this realm. And I think then my easiest response after saying that very brief thing would be to show you just my output from the course. And I think it might just answer you. So I'm just going to share my screen quickly. So as part of the course, I had to respond and kind of say, what I was perceiving from 6 weeks of us tackling different themes, from what my positionality was coming into the course, and then us going into hegemonies and homogeny, and then us tackling speculative thinking in and around what African fashion is with a question mark. And then us starting to sculpt our own words or sculpt our own ideas, or even continued question marks. That's the thing. I think, colonial thinking always, or colonial education always requires you to have that end result mapped out already. So, and the end result kind of situates itself back into the institutions that are already concrete, right? So you go in to study fashion and the end result is become a fashion designer. And it's not actually looking at the fact that the industry consists of so many other disciplines besides just the dressmaker, or besides what we now call the fashion designer. And so I think, when you look at a course like this that does say to you, step out of that and let's try to zone in on different areas of this conversation, you might end up with a result like this. And I'll just play this video for you. So it's just 5 minutes of my thinking around where I was by the end of the course. Oh, sorry, guys.
to be where.
Yes.
So I'm just going to come in here, just because we're seeing the video, but there isn't any sound.
Oh no.
And so I think a really interesting.
It's such an interesting perspective then if there's no sound.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it might just be because we're on Teams.
Okay. So let me just stop the video.
So, I mean, I think a really, really sort of interesting space to kind of sort of explore that as just a visual. But I think there was another kind of, and really interesting, that kind of silencing through the digital means right now, allowed for a different kind of reception of the images. But I think just to speak us through a little bit what you were doing with that cutting and that splicing, and then with the sound or the text that was part of that.
So yes, sorry about that. I thought the sound was happening. So the whole my research process after having put together the first thing while working with Erica became a process of uncovering these missing voices. And I've started a bit of a project entitled Siviwe, which means we are heard, which is my name. And the whole process came from this idea of if we're saying we are thinking differently about a system that isn't working, then that should include hearing differently or listening differently to those who have not been included. Whether they've not been included in the formal or they've only been considered as informal, I think is, besides the point. And so by putting together these different film fragments or these different films, my thinking is, to bring together the past to the present in a way where it starts to, not to consolidate itself, but it starts to allow one part of the time lapse to almost merge with the next bit. And we start to see the missing become more apparent. And so I think, to articulate myself better as well, I'm going to read just a little piece that will explain it better, written by my lovely partner in crime, Dr. Erica de Geer. That says, we experience the present via the way we come to know ourselves, via the past of ourselves, our ancestors, and more so. And this is where part of this work comes from. These visual essays, these videos, they become palimpsests, and they layer the images that you see on screen as a kind of haunting, and they become a series of decolonial rememberings that layer and disrupt. These filmic hauntings become ghostings of previous voices, messages, thoughts that are part of collective consciousness from an African positionality, They present a counterpoint or an alternative narrative that demands to know why these emotional, psychological, and philosophical rememberings as African are still so absent from critical writing, design thinking, and aesthetic appreciation. And in essence, the more you start to dig for pieces like this, I think that's when we start to uncover just how much is misplaced and how much hasn't been heard from, and how much if it had been heard from would be better understood now. And so I think, through these different works, I keep working through like a visual and a sonic landscape of these contemporary and archival fragments that allow us to kind of dig into elements of ourselves, whether spiritual, whether design-wise, and it's created its own little world of speculative thought and exploration of material signifiers that go deeper beyond, what we expect, and they are deeply embedded in some colonial violences that are experienced in the past. And so I think through the works, we get to work through a lot of that, whether it's the viewer experiencing these fragments or whether it's me working through them. Most of the time I'll find that the people who experience these works will have then these different rememberings or these different hauntings of what these fragments have given them. I don't know if there's enough time for me to add anything else, but have I covered it all, Erica?
No. What I think there's just so many beautiful thoughts that we're sharing, and thanks to Viwe. I think this idea of remembering, and the surfacing of remembering, and perhaps, as the very sort of much bigger social movements in the world are showing us that there's a collapse of the way in which modernity, the arrogance of modernity on coloniality, is being undermined and collapsing, and allowing for these rememberings to surface, these rememberings to come to surface. But it also, I think there is also a real necessity to heal. I'm just going to reflect very briefly on Sandra Neeson's work, and where she writes about sacrifice zones, and how the world, the colonial world, was built on these sacrifice zones that expended certain land, certain people, certain cultures, certain ecosystems at the expense of others. The fact that could exist in the imagination, and that is the colonial violence that we need to address at every single point. And the fashion system, and Jacob, I really appreciate your point. Can we actually have decolonial fashion or decolonized fashion? Can we actually, because the fashion system that demands cheap labor, that demands throughout its supply chain, not just in who makes your clothes, but who grows the cotton, and who, the labor exploitation and the sacrifice of cultures and peoples and lands through this greed of more viscose, for more fast fashion t-shirts that can get dumped into like Africa again, and this unbearable violence that is happening on the earth. So fashion is implied, and that's why I think it's absolutely necessary. And maybe just to come back to Frankie's point, what should fashion education be doing about this? It cannot fix the system, but it can certainly create awareness around that violence, and that is the first step of decoloniality. The first step of the decolonial method is to expose to recognize that coloniality and that violence. And then once we recognize it, we can start to unpack or explore, even attempt to go to those places of trauma or pain or erasure. And so the impact of coloniality, which I think Shana was also sort of talking about, the impact on how you define yourself, is an impact of coloniality. How you know yourself in the world, measured by a set of external signifiers. And then the third thing, and I think that's the most important thing, is that we start to build these narratives. We start to add or contribute to a discourse, creating platforms that highlight and like Kenneth. I mean, Kenneth didn't mention that he has also just published a book. I think it's coming out as well. So we're producing and Jacob, if you're actually producing collections that confront, and so it's these kinds of making present So no, Sibiwe wanted to say something. I know Shana wanted to say something. Sorry. Sibiwe?
I only wanted to add one thing in what you had said when you were speaking about colonization. And there's one thing, it was Rolando Vasquez, in his, my favorite reader on decolonial listening. And just on the introduction, he writes, there is no history of Western civilization without the history of suppression of other worlds. And this suppression continues to this day. The colonial difference is the border that gets established by this modern colonial order, and which separates what is seen, what is heard, and what is dignified from what is racialized, negated, erased, exploited, and extracted. Coloniality is about the erasure, and modernity is the forceful affirmation of the dominant world. When we look at historical reality through the tools of the modern, we become deaf and incapable of listening to other worlds. The task of listening is the task of bridging the colonial difference, and it requires several things, and he lists them, of course. And so I think it just emphasizes and just summarizes even what we've all been saying, especially what Jacob even said about, where you can't decolonize fashion, but I found it interesting how you spoke about style, how you started to just like strip it apart and say, we can work on style and the clothing itself. Yeah, Shana. She got that.
There's two things I want to say. I'll circle back to the other one, but I think, and I don't know if Jacob remembered this, mentioned this, but one of the things that there's so many reasons why I love All We Remember, but just in terms of what we were talking about, and Erica, what you mentioned about Erica and Sibiwe, what you both have mentioned about erasure, I just wanted to sort of, I'll circle back to the second thing I wanted to say, but I just wanted to call to Jacob and to talk a little bit about the name All We Remember, because there are so many reasons why All We Remember is a practicing decolonial fashion brand or clothing brand or style brand, but a business nonetheless that is operating within the fashion system in so many decolonial ways, especially in the naming of All We Remember, which literally gets to the heart of bringing out how much erasure happens in coloniality.
Yeah, thank you for that, Shana. And again, I appreciate your characterization of the brand. I and we as a collective, I hesitate to take on words like decoloniality and even sustainability, because we are implicit in the system by operating within the fashion industry. And so I like to emphasize us trying to do work through action versus taking on these overarching terms that frankly are very often co-opted by multinational corporations in order to sell more products and do things that are even more ingrained in white supremacy, capitalism, and other systems of oppression. Regarding the name, there's definitely a Jungian aspect to it. It's also very much tethered to, I think, as you and other panelists have talked about, remembering, both in terms of processes. So us working with natural dyes, us working with organic materials, and also the people and peoples who have kept those processes alive and sustained them, such as for some of our garments for our initial collection, we used color-grown cotton. which I think that at least in the United States, people generally think of cotton as being white, which I also think of as being makes complete sense. I don't know if it's ironic, 'cause it's disturbing when you think about white supremacy and whiteness. Like, of course, we think of something that comes in many, many varieties and colors as being strictly white. But despite that, right, there are all of these different natural varieties, strains of cotton that come in ecru and khaki and olive green, and even some like reddish hues that for the most part, indigenous people in Central and South America have sustained for thousands and thousands of years. And so it's in engaging with materials like that while acknowledging the history of them and the people who have sustained them. I think also pointing out the collectivity, like the word we to me is really deeply important. And the way in which we are all tethered to one another and tethered to the earth and the universe. Hopefully this isn't getting too out there, but I'm Jewish. I'm not super religious, but I really deeply believe both scientifically and spiritually in the interconnectivity of everything and the connection of matter. And love, actually, Thomas Berry talks about how we need to start thinking about the earth or the universe as being a kingdom full of subjects instead of full of objects. Because I think we very often treat plant life, animals, bacteria, other living organisms as objects, and then that plays into the way we treat one another and view one another as human beings. So it's also about calling out the interconnectivity of all of us and all of the different people that are required to make a garment. I may be the designer of the brand, and frankly, I do a lot of things for the brand. Like I do our pattern making and our sample making, and also if those are just a few components of this like grand interconnected chain, because if there wasn't the cotton and the cotton farmers and Blue Tin Production, our cotton sew manufacturer, and Fiber Active Organics to makes thread, and the spinners that they work, the organic spinners that they work with in India. So it's just like we are all so deeply connected, and I think we do ourselves a disservice by, especially in the United States, I think as a country we've sold and bought into this idea of the American dream and bootstrapping and individual exceptionalism. And I just don't think that anyone can really do anything without other people or beings involved. So it's also about calling to that.
Mm-hmm.
Kenneth, do you find that where you at the moment, that interconnectedness, how do you, is there a sense of that happening for you as well?
Well, yes, I did want to initially make a comment with regards to Jacob's point, and I concur absolutely with him with respect to the very ideal of fashion. Fashion as a universal concept it's not amenable to decoloniality or nization. Shayna will pardon me. I'm not the quintessential student of decolonial studies. I'm sure that I had this conversation earlier with Petro, and I said I'm joining this by virtue of the fact that my work basically with this book that I'm writing on African luxury happens to be some way, somehow, an attempt to also tell the story from from the dimension of what we do or what we have done as Africans. And so in a way that sort of like sits within this whole context and of decolonization. Quite frankly, the contemporary practice of consumption is alien to the African ideal. I talk about the aesthetics of the sacred in one of the books, and I explore our way of consumption where we, for example, the carver before cutting down, this is somewhere in West Africa, before he would cut down a tree to carve whatever art piece, would pour libation or would pray, would actually say a word of prayer to sanctify that act, to sort of like ask for some form of reprobation or some form of, I would say, forgiveness, if I should put it that way, before he would actually cut down the tree. And this also, we can also talk about examples of I'm happy that Jacob talks about the actors in the supply chain working with dyers that are using organic materials instead of the chemical based dyes. In Kofomata in Nigeria, they still, this happens to be 5 centuries long of practice and the use of the traditional organic based dyes. They still do this. I mean, against the temptation to actually adapt to the modern way of doing things. And so I'm trying to make the point that we are somewhat, this whole way of contemporary consumption and production and this cycle of exploitation and quote unquote unsustainability is all some way somehow alien to us. And these are some of the conversations that we definitely need to be having. I have always asked this question. So I remember a presentation that I made sometime back in Cape Town in 2018. And I happened to be, I'd say, like the only person that spoke on luxury in Africa. And the question that I was asking myself eventually at the conclusion of my presentation was, now, what exactly does this continent bring to the table? Now, if we wanted to be a part of this so badly, or if you wanted to actually be recognized, our role or our part in the global luxury economy had to be recognized, what exactly what difference will it make to actually have Africa be prominent in the global luxury economy? And I use the opportunity to explore what I call the 5 cardinal points of African luxury, which I also discuss in the book. But then obviously sustainability, exploring all of these things that were basically embedded in how we consume and in how we interact and how we engage with our environment. There is one lady who actually has this brand. What's the name of the brand name? It has escaped me. I'll just type it in once it comes. And she brought up this concept of Lux Ubuntu, and Lux Ubuntu basically talks about infusing, approaching luxury based on the things that actually make us who we are, our culture as Africans. And so basically that for me is how I see this, especially in the aspect of luxury. If indeed we have this responsibility to put Africa on the global pedestal in that sphere, we need to definitely ensure that whatever that the continent or we bring to the table actually makes a difference.
So, but any other questions, maybe from the audience, and maybe to conclude. So absolutely love the work that you're doing. It sounds sensitive, so sensitive towards your subject. I would love to see the outcome of that one day. And Shana, wonderful ideas. Jacob, it's been great. Erica and Kenneth, I really enjoyed this. So, are there any other questions?
Yeah, Frankie, just to come in here, it is 7, and I know that Shana and Sifiwe both had other commitments to go to, so I want to respect that. And if there are any particular questions for Shana or Sifiwe, we can forward these to you. But I want to say thank you very much for joining us, Shana. Thank you very much, Sifiwe. Hopefully, Jacob and Kenneth, we might be able to just hold the space a little bit longer for any kinds of questions.
I just wanted to say before I leave that Eric and I will be participating in 2 different conferences where you can see a bit more of the video works. So I will post those up. The one will be for the American University of Paris, and then the other one will be for Pars, if I'm not mistaken. One is collective, and then the one will be just Eric and I, but we'll post the details and you can definitely check that out. But thank you for the time. It's been fantastic sitting in with all these smart people.
Thank you so much.
Nice to see you, Sifiwe. I also just wanted to say before I go, same conference, Erica and I will be, we've got 2 conferences as well coming up. So just on, decoloniality and fashion and the work that we do with the research collective for the research collective of decoloniality and fashion, for decoloniality and fashion. And I also just wanted to take a second before I popped off. I know Petra and Stephanie definitely encouraged me to explain what it is that I do. So Frankie, as you highlighted at the beginning, that my career it definitely exists within the liminality of both the space of academia, education, and industry. And so being a conscious marketing consultant means that I do work with brands like Jacob's brand, with organizations, companies, businesses like Jacob's that, try as much as possible to practice sustainability, to practice consciousness, to practice various forms of just adding value to the world and adding good practice to people's lives that help us feel more whole and more included rather than excluded. And so of course, and I guess there are probably students on this and a lot of people within the field of education. Of course, there are the skills and tools like marketing strategies, social media strategies, creative direction, all of these very interesting tools. But then, of course, using those to publicize the greatness that these fair trade practicing brands do. And then, of course, working in academia, writing, giving talks, and developing educational courses that integrate education into the business sector. So if there is anyone here today that is interested in any of those things, please feel free to get in touch with Stadio. They know how to get in touch with me. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shana. Thank you. Right. Okay. Erica?
Thank you so much. Yeah, no, I'm just wondering if there are any kinds of questions coming from the floor, or how we, if anybody has received any questions. I think these kinds of dialogues are always there are questions that happen along the way, and then at the end there's a kind of sort of sense of like, where do I even start with a question, because we've kind of traveled a journey, and we've really sort of walked this terrain, and it is such a complex terrain. So I'm very happy that we have been able to have the conversation. I think an important component to this is the idea of being able to listen, being able to platform, being able to consider alternate positionalities, and particularly how that manifests in the classroom. How does this play out in the curriculum? How does this play out in accreditations of programs? How does this play out in future participation in a fashion system? I love the word that Jacob, you used, was you spoke about the writer Barry, and you said he was an ecologian. I thought it was a really important kind of like that new words and new beings are possible, new leaders are possible, new kinds of ways of being in the world are possible, and perhaps this is also a place where we are exploring new terms for this dialogue, whether it's I mean, Carol Tulloch and her sort of invocation of style, dress, fashion. So she also works with this idea that it isn't just fashion, but that this is a much more complex set of terms, and the sort of complexity to add to that complexity does demand more fluid systems, and the impact of modernity was to strategize those systems so they weren't fluid, they were fixed, they were secure, they were unidirectional, and our work is to counter that and to build more fluid or more open or more diverse systems, structures, support mechanisms, just even in making, but also in dialogue, in writing, in the language we use. So I'm absolutely, I'm very delighted that we have had this conversation. Jacob, it was lovely to meet you. Kenneth, it was lovely to be in the room with you again. I'm just wondering if there's some closing words, maybe from Kenneth or from Jacob, just to.
Jacob, after you.
Oh, thank you, Kenneth. Thank you, Erica. Frankie, thank you as well. Yeah, first, thank you for having me. I hope that this was meaningful for everyone who attended. It was definitely meaningful and educational for me. I think that with the subject of education coming up over and over again, I think something that I am continuing to think of is how we can transform universities. And I think a big part of that needs to be listening to young people. And I had a student a few years ago who basically said something to the effect of Columbia College Chicago shouldn't be training her for the industry. We should be training the industry for her and for the other students. And I think that one thing that I am seeing play out, at least where I teach, is this battle between prepping students for the fashion industry that currently exists, which is capitalistic, white supremacist, misogynistic, patriarchal, ableist, all of these really negative things, and trying to sort of also inform students of ways to break the systems. And I think more needs to happen in that line. And I think also, as long as we exist within capitalism, at least in the United States, also there needs to be more opportunities and more funding given to students, and at least here especially students of color and indigenous students, because the fashion industry is incredibly expensive to exist in. And if we want to support young people doing important work, we need to be able to give them space and funding to be able to do that, so that they don't have to just get fed into the industry, into a 50-hour, a week job where they're just doing, CAD flats for a major designer. So I think I'd like to leave it there. And again, to just thank all of you again for having me, and kind of thank you as well. It was incredibly informative to listen to you.
Kenneth? Yes.
Jacob, thank you, Erica, and thank you, Frankie, for having me. It was definitely an eye-opener, even more so for me, because, like I said, I'm not the quintessential decolonization student. I am actually having conversations with Erica towards my PhD, and I'm definitely sure that with such a great mind, I would actually be able to contribute remarkably to conversations around decolonization. I am certain. I mean, like, if we're trying to distill the point of all this conversation that we've had, especially to students and to prospective students, the fundamental point of decolonization is the diversity of voices and originality, given that opportunity for people to be who they are and to be able to articulate what they are, with respect to whatever their background, whatever their belief, their cultural, what you call orientations, etc. And that is, if there is anything that you'd take from this almost incredible conversation, that is what you'd have to take along, that you definitely need to shed those lenses, that sort of constrain you to think beyond and outside what society like has established, and being able to emerge in that form of original, with an original voice that is able to actually take you beyond what you ever could have imagined. I am really, really grateful for this opportunity. I may also use opportunity to just probably put in a word on what I'm doing. Those that are interested would be able to probably just read a bit of my upcoming book on this website. I'm typing it in the chat box. Luxury Fashion in Africa.com. And so that was the initial name, but the book is actually coming out with an alternate name, Vanguard of African Fashion, and hopefully should be out in spring 2022. I'm definitely sure that a lot of us in here would have the opportunity to read and to access it and be able to impact your respective practices and design careers. Thank you very much.
Unmuting. Okay. Thank you for a fabulous, fabulous session. From all of us at Stadia, we really appreciate your time and the valuable input that you had within the session. Thank you, Erica, Jacob, Kenneth. It's been an absolute pleasure. And you must have a good day, Jacob. I think it is a day. And Erica and Kenneth, you need to have a good evening. But thank you again. And hopefully in the near future, we can have and discuss these developments again. And it will be in 10 years' time, and we will look back and it will be a wonderful conference.
I hope we will be able to speak before 10 years' time. I think this is urgent work, and I think this is ongoing work. So absolutely. Thank you so much, Frankie, and thank you for inviting us onto the panel. And yeah, good luck with the rest of your spring sessions.
Thank you so much, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Yeah.